Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. We're pleased to welcome Richard Williams, Director for the Regulatory Studies Program at the Mercatus Center and former Director for Social Sciences at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Richard, welcome to the show.
Thank you, and thank you for having me.
Richard, I asked you on because your expertise is in the consequence of overregulation, which not only impacts U.S. economic growth, but is one of the reasons given by our British cousins for their decision to seek a divorce with the EU. I'd like to start at home, and even more narrowly with the Food and Drug Administration, where you formerly served as the Associate Director for Social Services. What were your responsibilities there?
Well, I was there for 27 years, and I was the Social Science Director for the Food Safety and Applied Nutrition part of FDA. And my responsibilities were for economics, and that's regulatory impact analysis, consumer studies, which is the survey of consumers' knowledge and attitudes, and epidemiology.
And did you get to hang out at all with the drug regulators while you were there?
Not so much. I've spent the last several years looking into that side of the FDA, the drugs and medical devices side.
I mean, the FDA is 110 years old now. How would you describe the culture?
I would describe it as a very closed culture. They are very much into FDA being in control. Most of the people at the FDA don't believe in markets, and they don't like markets. They think that sellers always take advantage of buyers, and they think that every single thing should be regulated. Let me give you an example. When Congress told FDA we could do something about safety of dietary supplements, we looked into dietary supplements and how they were made. That was mostly what Congress wanted to look at. Were they produced safely? We looked into it for a year trying to find a problem and literally just couldn't find anything. So I went to the head of that program and I said, you know what? Congress didn't say we had to do a regulation. There doesn't seem to be a problem here. Maybe we shouldn't do anything. And her response to me was, but Richard, we have to get these guys somewhere. And I think that is exactly the kind of sentiment that you get from FDA on every product that's under their purview.
Wow.
We have to get these guys somewhere.
One of the things that's not obvious to everyone is that the FDA can literally kill thousands of people without any consequences by holding a useful drug off the market. And yet if there's the smallest allegation that a new drug might be associated with bad side effects, all hell breaks loose and a plague of class action lawyers gets released. What is it about the asymmetry of publicity and the nature of modern journalism and tort law that creates this situation?
Well, it's not just tort law and journalism. It's also Congress. But it really is all of those, and I think it's a mistake. If you think about it, with any individual drug, when they're approved, they go through what they call randomized clinical control trials. But no matter what, there's only a certain number of people. Maybe it's even several thousand people in those trials. There's no way that a trial could uncover a drug that would be safe and efficacious for 320 million Americans. We're just too different for that to happen. So you're always going to get some kind of a problem with a drug. Somebody is going to be harmed, or it's not going to work for somebody. And there's no way that FDA can ever be responsible for making sure that they're safe and effective for everyone. So having said that, what happens? When something does go wrong, the press picks up on it, and they blame FDA, and I believe incorrectly blame FDA. Congress will hold a hearing and ask, why have you done this? Why is this a problem? And in fact, we're holding FDA responsible for something that literally they just don't have that kind of control. And the real question is, why do we give FDA so much control in the first place?
Is there any way that FDA regulators can be given a little bit of a safe harbor that would make it more likely for them to let drugs through rather than hold them back for so long?
Absolutely, they could do that. They could look at the safety of the drug, which is pretty much the first phase of clinical trials, and then they could say beyond that, we're going to let doctors and their patients make those decisions. That's not what happens. What happens is now you have 3 phases of clinical trials. It costs $2.6 billion to bring a drug to market, and that normally takes about 12 years. So what happens is a lot of drugs get discouraged. And in point of fact, the other thing that happens is because we go through clinical trials, and those clinical trials are basically for the average person, so does the average person improve? We get a lot of drugs that should be on the market that aren't. So they might cure some people. In fact, they do. But if they don't cure enough people to pass the clinical trial, they don't get onto the market. Now we know with individualized medicine, what's important is that they cure some people, and we have to figure out what are the characteristics of those people that it works for. What are their genetic characteristics? What are their health conditions? Why does it work for those people? Then we'll know precisely who to give those drugs to. That's called personalized or individualized medicine. That's where we're going, and it's going to make the clinical trials that were the former gold standard obsolete.
I have many friends and colleagues in the biotech and medical device businesses, and we get together for drinks. They tell me one horror story after another about dealing with the FDA, but I can't get any of them to come on the air and tell these stories because they fear for retribution. Has the FDA always used its power to punish critics?
Absolutely. FDA has always been very conscious of their public reputation. So if you are under FDA's purview, so if you're a drug maker or you make food or you make medical devices, you can't speak out against the FDA because they will hold it against you. If you need pre-approval, such as for a drug, a medical device, or a food or color additive, you're going to have a problem. And there are people who specialize in being nice to FDA, understanding FDA's rules and regulations, and understanding their culture and being nice to them. That's important if you have to get something approved. If you're under them for the regulatory purposes, you're going to get singled out. And for those people that aren't under FDA's purview, by that I mean people in Congress, people on the Hill, FDA actively courts them. And I also include the Academy of that. They actively court them to try to enhance their reputation. It's very, very important to them. That's what keeps the money flowing.
One of the areas you've worked on is nutrition and food labeling. Environmental scaremongers have mounted a high-visibility campaign against GMOs or genetically modified food crops. I've seen polls that indicate that a majority of Americans are in favor of mandatory labeling for any food that contains DNA. What do you make of such powerful ignorance?
I think that we are, as a country, scientifically illiterate. Do you mind if I give you a list of some things that people are illiterate about when it comes to food?
Sure.
So first of all, most people in this country do not need to avoid eating too much salt. That's just not the case, which means a lot of what's going on with salt is not scientifically correct. Added sugars are not any different than natural sugars that you find in fruits, for example. They're all caloric, and it doesn't make any difference. So putting added sugars on the label is just responding to that ignorance because it really is saying there's a difference between sugars when there's not. How about carcinogens? A lot of people are very upset when they hear they might be eating something that causes cancer. Well, given the animal tests that we do, if you believe in the animal test, which is basically giving these things to rodents, here's a couple of facts that you should know. You get more carcinogens in a cup of coffee, 1 cup of coffee, than in all of the pesticide residues that you ingest in a year. Does that mean coffee will give you cancer? Absolutely not. It just means pesticide residues are extremely safe because you ingest so few of them. Fruits and vegetables are loaded with carcinogens. So again, if you believe the rodent studies, you probably ought to just not go to the supermarket and eat anything. And then there's the idea of people who want to eat organic foods. How many people know, for example, that organic foods are 4 to 8 times more likely to be recalled for food poisoning? This is a kind of ignorance, and it's been transferred over to GMOs, which are some of the safest foods that you're going to eat on this planet. And they're just the result of getting better at crossbreeding, which has now been done for 8,000 to 10,000 years.
The manipulation of public fears of GMOs have some pretty dire consequences when it comes to African agricultural economies, particularly in relation to their exports to the EU. Fill us in on that.
Well, it's not something that I know a lot about, but I do know that the potential for genetically modified organisms is huge in terms of solving a lot of problems, including for Africans. Look, the important thing is they do enhance yields. You use less water when you have GMO crops. Golden rice has been responsible for reducing blindness in Africa, among other places, and that's a genetically modified food. And yet, we have the activists going out and being against it, and it's not clear why. Let me give you another example where activists have caused, in my mind, a lot of illnesses and deaths. One of the great promises in the 1980s and 1990s for keeping people from being sick was irradiation. The food activists got out and immediately invoked Hiroshima. They said, oh, you're going to be eating radiation. Nothing could be further than the truth. It's extremely safe. Here's the amount of radiation that's left in the food after you irradiate it. If you're sitting down outside and you stand up, you're that much closer to the sun. That's how much radiation would be remaining in a food that was irradiated. Yet it kills pathogens and probably would have prevented hundreds of thousands of cases of foodborne disease. But the activists killed it.
Richard, let's move on to the aftermath of Brexit. Now that the initial shock has worn off, people are taking a serious look at the long-term consequences of the UK leaving the EU. I've heard many critics of Brexit who point out that the British yes minister bureaucracy is just as bad and unaccountable as the one in Brussels, so why should they expect anything to change? Do they have a point?
I think they do have a point. And there's a great book, and I put it in one of the op-eds that I wrote, called How to Label a Goat. And it's about both EU and British regulations, and they're equally bad. So I think if the British people are going to do this, first of all, they may have to still follow some EU regulations, particularly if they want to export to EU countries. But I think they need to look at their own system and say, how can we improve it? How can we be better than the EU? And make sure that those people that want to exercise bureaucratic control over every part of your life don't get control. Let me give you an example of a quote I heard. I was in England, and it was a number of British regulators and EU regulators from all over the EU. A very high-ranking official from the EU stood up, and he gave the keynote talk, and he said, there are a number of areas of life that we do not have regulations for. He goes, this is something that we've got to immediately start working on. And there was wild applause by the entire crowd.
Is it true that chicken farmers in the UK have to label every egg with the identity of the chicken, or did some wag just make that up?
It was in that same book, How to Label a Goat, and what it said was that, yes, you have to label when the egg was laid and what was the name of the chicken. And frankly, I didn't even know all the chickens had names, but maybe, you've got to put February and Ethel.
What was the point of that?
It cost £5,000 for these machines. And I suppose the point is, if the egg is bad, you can trace it back to the chicken that caused the problem.
What would it take to repeal those kinds of vexatious regulations? I mean, there's a lot of politics involved. How would you sweep up and make a clean slate of the whole thing?
There are ways to do it. In fact, we've written a paper about this as part of Retrospective review, and I think the way to do it is you don't go try to look at every single individual regulation. We have 175,000 pages of regulations in this country. You simply couldn't do it regulation by regulation. I think you have to look overall at the program and say, is this program necessary anymore? Let me give you an example of one in our country that may not be necessary anymore. I don't know. We've had tremendous success with the Clean Air Act. Every single one of the NACs, so-called NACs, now has been reduced to very low levels. So the question today is not, was EPA successful in getting these airborne pollutants reduced? They were. The question is now, should we go any farther when they're so low? We may be at the point where they're at the threshold, where they're not causing any harm to anybody. So maybe we want to keep continuing to enforce the rules that we have, but it may be time for the Clean Air Act to be revised to say we don't need to go any lower. That's a program that maybe can end. But we don't have anything like that in this country. One of the things that I think would be useful comes from a fellow that works with me who used to be a labor minister in New Zealand. And when they had a program that would come up for renewal and they were asking to be refunded, which we do every year for our regulatory agencies, he had several questions that I thought were useful that we don't actually ask in this country. Let me give you some of those questions. What is the outcome goal? What is it that you're actually trying to achieve that will help consumers? What actions will you take in order to achieve this outcome? How much is it going to cost us? And here are the key questions. How will we know when you're done, and when will you be done? And could someone else do it better? We don't ever ask anybody, when will you be done? We pass laws, we put in place regulations and regulatory agencies, and we never ask, when will you be finished? When will you solve the problem? I think that's a good thing to start to ask.
You mentioned New Zealand. In the late 1980s and early 90s, they made some radical deregulatory changes that completely revitalized their economy, making it into one of the freest and most prosperous in the world. Could that be a roadmap for the UK now that they're breaking away from the EU?
I certainly hope so. And if they're going to follow that roadmap, they should do what they started to do in the 1980s. But then, unfortunately, and this happens so frequently, then slowly but surely they started to regulate themselves again. I'm not sure there's a good roadmap for anybody. I think it's one we have to invent before we just strangle ourselves with too many regulations, in particular, regulations that don't work. If they're regulations that cost too much or that aren't solving a problem, we've got to get rid of them and never bring them back.
Contrary to public misconceptions, big business loves regulations, especially if they crush small business. Would Brexit have any impact on that dynamic?
It's interesting. Again, I think it depends upon what the British end up doing. But that's fairly universal. Generally, larger businesses are able to hire legal staff to find ways to interact with the regulatory bureaus in order to get the regulations that they like. Not always and not all of them, but usually the people that suffer are going to be the small businesses that simply don't have the time or the resources to engage in the regulatory process. So a lot of times the regulations will hurt them. Particularly, there's a whole group of people that get hurt that never interact, and that's the people that someday would like to start a business, the potential entrants. They don't exist yet, and there's nobody there to protect them.
Much of Brexit was fueled by seething anger in parts of the population that really weren't connected to the ruling elite. We're seeing a lot of that here in the U.S. Do these folks understand the connection between the economic rigor mortis that seems to be setting in across the Western world and the overregulation that's caused a lot of it?
I think that is going to be the interesting question for our time, and hopefully we will find out in the next few years whether or not we actually have that kind of reaction. For most people in this country, they feel that we are overregulated. That's over half of the people in the United States feel we're overregulated. You then ask them about specific areas, and they go, well, we need regulations in that area. So they understand that there's a problem. They don't understand the depth of the problem, and most people don't. It's very complex. It's very hard for Congress to oversee. All the presidents, going back all the way at least to Jimmy Carter, if not to President Hoover, have said it's extremely difficult to oversee the executive branch. So I think hopefully this is the sort of thing that people will wake up and go, it's time to do something. Look, the last major law that was passed affecting how we produce regulations was passed 70 years ago. In 1946, that was the Administrative Procedures Act. Congress hasn't done anything since then. It's time Congress woke up, did something about it, and hopefully people will get behind Congress and say, yes, it's time to pass something. It's time to solve some of these problems.
Well, that takes leadership, which begs the question, will we ever see another Margaret Thatcher or Ronald Reagan? Or are the electorates in both the UK and the US too addicted to entitlements to try to turn the clock back?
Well, that's an interesting question, too. I don't think the entitlements are going to be turned back necessarily, not the way we would hope they would do. I think what's going to happen is they will either collapse or they will nearly collapse, and certainly Social Security is heading that way. The ACA almost certainly is collapsing now, and I think it's going to take a collapse before Congress is able to act. I don't think they're going to be able to act until we literally are in a very desperate situation.
If centrifugal forces pry the EU apart and there's a major international realignment, could a free trade pact amongst the English-speaking nations, the US, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, come along as a counterbalance to the old EU?
Certainly. Trade is good for everyone. Trade is always good. This is sort of economics 101. It's amazing how many people don't get that. It's good for both sides of the trade. And so I'm sure there would be an emphasis on ensuring that trade within the EU happens, and not only within the EU, but the EU and us and everyone for that matter.
So, Richard, food safety seems to come on everyone's mind every time we have another Chipotle disaster or some kind of a high-visibility poisoning that takes place somewhere in the fast food business. How has the U.S. done over time in that area, and how safe is our food supply?
Well, first of all, our food supply is very safe. And the real question is, what does FDA have to do with it now, particularly? And the answer is not very much. They cause us to incur a lot of costs. But I was at the FDA for 27 years, and the numbers of cases of foodborne disease literally didn't change in 27 years, despite the fact we passed lots of regulation. The problem is, there's several problems. First of all, the approach that we take with food safety is we try to anticipate every problem, pass a regulation that prevents that problem from happening, and then we go out and inspect all the firms to comply. That technology, that regulatory technology, is old. That's the technology that we started in 1870. And it's old and it doesn't work anymore. For a lot of manufacturers, FDA is irrelevant. So what can we do instead? How can we actually improve it? In fact, there is a role for FDA. What we could do is when we do have an outbreak, we now have the technology where we can go back, trace that outbreak back to who caused it, and then we can investigate the outbreak, find out what caused it. All you have to do is put that on the internet. What caused this particular outbreak? What you will find is that insurance companies and downstream buyers will pick that up. They'll put it in their private food safety contracts, and this is already happening, hundreds of thousands of these contracts around the country, and manufacturers will fix it themselves. You don't really need to regulate. You can't inspect anyway. If you look at who sells food in this country, there's over 1 million outlets. There's no way that FDA is going to be able to inspect them with any frequency that makes sense. The way I like to put it is you go into your child's room and you say, boy, you need to get this room cleaned up right now, and I'll be back in 6 years to inspect you. How much of an incentive is that? That's pretty much what FDA tells people.
Well, it'd be very interesting if big data and communications end up solving the problems that FDA spent all this time and money on. Richard, thanks so much for coming on the show and sharing your expertise, and we'll talk to you again in the future.
Okay, thank you.
That was Richard Williams, Director for the Regulatory Studies Program at the Mercatus Center and former Director for Social Sciences at the FDA, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. You can check out Real Clear Radio Hour on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. And while you're at it, take a look at realclearfuture.com for updates on the next big wave of technologies. We'd like to thank our long-term sponsor, Old Boston Restorations, for their support. Old Boston is a Victorian property management company in Boston's South End. Visit them online at oldbostonrestorations.com. That wraps up our show for this week. Please join us next week, same time, same station. See you then.